for a really great discussion. So as you'll just have heard, this webinar is being recorded, and we will be sharing a summary of this session plus a recording afterwards. We have, in terms of an agenda, several fantastic speakers, and then we've allowed about 25 minutes at the end for a panel discussion where all of the speakers will be invited back to share their thoughts and answer your questions. In the meantime, though, there's a lot of people on this webinar, so I'd really encourage you to use the chat box and the Q&A function. So if you have questions as we go through, if you pop those questions in the Q&A using the sort of toggle at the bottom, we'll endeavour to get those answered for you during the session. But we also encourage discussion throughout. I don't want to delay any further because we've got lots to get through, and our first speaker is someone we're really excited to hear from. His name is Richard Thompson, and he's an expert on hazardous chemicals and wastes, and is an independent consultant who worked on the FAO report on agriplastics that Mary mentioned just now to you. And yeah, I think just without further ado, Richard, I'll let you kind of introduce yourself, but also kind of dive us straight into the topic. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Chris. Hopefully you can see my screen on full slide view.
That's correct. Yeah, we can.
Great. Okay. So greetings, everyone, and many thanks to EIA for this opportunity to present FAO's report, Assessment of Agricultural Plastics and Their Sustainability, a Call for Action. As Mary said, I was one of the co-authors. The report presents the results of a study investigating plastic products used globally in a range of agricultural value chains. It assessed the types and quantities of plastic products and their benefits and trade-offs. We hope it will provide an impetus for discussion about agricultural plastics and ultimately stimulate action to reduce their potential for harm and improve their circularity. So what does it say? Well, firstly, what are agricultural plastics? So here are some examples. There are polymer-coated controlled release fertilizers, fertilizer sacks, big bags, seedling plugs and trays, mulching films, greenhouse films, shade and protective nets, drip irrigation tape, irrigation pipes, plant supports and ties, pesticide containers, reusable harvesting crates, hermetically sealed sacks for harvest storage, bale nets and twines, silage tubes, film wrap for silage bales, covers for bunkers, livestock ear tags, tree guards, tree labels and ties, fishing nets, boat gear, shellfish traps, repurposed drums for icing fish, and insulated fish boxes. Just a few examples. In a report, we estimated that every year 12.5 million tons of plastic products are used globally, which is equivalent to 3.5% of the global plastic production. Add to this, close to 37 million tons are used in food packaging. Unfortunately, we couldn't find reliable data to estimate plastics used in storage, processing, and distribution. So the primary focus of the report is on plastics used in production. Crop production and livestock sectors are the largest users, accounting for just over 10 million tons per year, followed by fisheries and aquaculture with 2.1 million tons, and forestry at 0.2 million tons. These are also indicative of the annual quantities that become waste or leak into the environment. European terrestrial agriculture generates approximately 700 tons of plastic waste each year. The majority are films used in silage production, either as bale wrap or clamp covers, greenhouse films, tunnels, and for mulching. So why are they used? Mulching films and drip irrigation increase crop yields, improve water use efficiency, suppress weeds and mold on fruit, reducing the use of agrochemicals. Coated fertilizers provide constant delivery of nutrients to root zone, improving efficiency of uptake, avoiding emissions to atmosphere and runoff to surface waters. Greenhouses and tunnels extend growing seasons, improve yields and quality, and give farmers access to new markets. Bagging growing bananas protects the fruit from weather and insect damage. Hermetically sealed sacks reduce food loss during storage. The plastic fishing gear is durable, light, and effective. So what are the trade-offs? The trade-offs in the fishery sector have been well documented. For example, with ghost gear continuing to kill fish, as we'll hear later from Joel. And often users don't have the capacity for selection, application, management, and retrieval of plastics. Most farmers and fishers lack access to sound environmental end-of-life management, resulting in plastic waste often left contaminating soils, coasts, and the sea, or being dumped or burnt. Only a small fraction is recycled. Introduction of biodegradable plastic films brings additional complexity and challenge because of variability and degradation depending on local conditions. Evidence from China on mulching use has shown that accumulation of plastics above 240 kilograms per hectare in surface soils can decrease crop yields by 25%. Our simulation with best practice retrieval rates between 90 and 98% showed that with continuous use of mulching, this level of contamination could be reached between 14 and 70 years. Plastic products production also contributes to greenhouse gas emissions and thus climate change. Microplastics are resulting from, for example, from washing synthetic clothing, end up in wastewater systems. And where these are processed through wastewater treatment plants, the microplastics are concentrated in the sewage sludge, which is often used as a soil amendment. The German Nature and Biodiversity Conservation Union, NABU, estimated that the national annual emissions of plastic to the environment from agricultural activities, terrestrial agricultural activities, at 13,000 tons. 63% of this, some 8,000 tons, is microplastics in sewage sludge amendments applied to soil. This diagram shows the potential pathways for degraded agricultural plastics to other media and their impacts. Microplastic contamination in soil come from degradation during the use of agricultural plastics, their inappropriate disposal on farms, and the use of soil amendments. Agricultural soils are thought to receive greater quantities of microplastics in the oceans. Furthermore, they absorb and concentrate persistent organic pollutants, and as such, they likely present as yet unquantified risks to human health. Microplastics from terrestrial agriculture have been shown to migrate to aquatic environments. This is now a major topic of research with an explosion of new publications, especially related to contamination of food. There is evidence that nanoplastics may cross cell membranes, where there is potential to accumulate and impair cellular physiology and evoke inflammatory responses. Micro and microplastics are thought to present specific risks to animal health through ingestion, entanglement, and biomagnification. So we selected typical value chains for each of the 4 agricultural sectors and identified the plastic products that were used in each and assessed the comparative risks that each product posed. The risks were assessed on the basis of the source, the extent and frequency of their use, pathway, the likelihood of the plastic entering the environment through damage, degradation, or littering, the receptor, the extent of its contact with terrestrial and aquatic environments, and the consequence, its potential to harm plants, animals, and humans. And this is the list of the prioritization of the products. Those that pose the greatest risk are polymer-coated fertilizer, mulching films, pesticide containers, bale films and nets, expanded polystyrene fish boxes, irrigation tape, fishing gear and aquaculture cages, and pesticide impregnated bags for banana fruit protection. And these were investigated further and potential alternatives identified. Identifying their benefits and trade-offs, so the priority products were reviewed in detail, identifying their benefits and trade-offs, and the issues that cause them. Strong scientific evidence shows that plastics in agriculture can be both beneficial and also detrimental to food security and food safety. However, there is no silver bullet solution to this complex material problem. Many of them lie in a systematic application of the 6 R's approach: refuse, redesign, reduce, reuse, recycle, and recover. But options should be assessed for each particular application and in specific local contexts using life cycle approaches. Some examples of the potential alternatives that we identified include alternative products and practices that avoid plastics altogether, for example, cover crops and biomass to replace plastic mulching films, reusable and durable products such as glass and durable plastic covers for greenhouses. Biodegradable polymers are promising materials for plant supports and mulching films. Mandatory extended producer responsibility for the collection and recycling of all non-biodegradable plastics, and incentive mechanisms to encourage sustainable practice. In summary, the initial analysis of management responses suggests that there's no single international governance framework that addresses plastics use in agriculture holistically and allows to balance its environmental and social economic benefits and trade-offs. Agricultural plastics, apart from those used in the marine environment, are primarily unregulated by international instruments, with only very few scattered and residual elements being addressed in legal instruments with a different scope. The United Nations Environment Assembly, as we've heard later in February, will debate a proposal to start negotiations for a new international agreement on plastic pollution. The EIA must be congratulated for their advocacy for this initiative. And this is encouraging news. However, the extent to which agricultural plastics will be addressed and the speed of its negotiation are not certain. Soft law instruments such as international voluntary guidelines have proven very effective in assisting countries to adopt national legislation covering specific agricultural activities. Good examples are the Code of Conduct on Responsible Fisheries and the International Code of Conduct on Pesticide Management. Because they don't impose obligations on signatories, soft law instruments can be established more rapidly and can have a wider scope than internationally binding agreements. They can also cover obligations of the key stakeholder groups, whereas international agreements are limited to obligations of national governments. We recommend adopting a two-pronged approach. While negotiations on binding international agreements proceed, a new holistic voluntary code of conduct, specifically on agricultural plastics, could be established. We think that this will be the most effective way to support changes on the ground, and this has been proposed for consideration at FAO's Committee for Agriculture in July. The new Code of Conduct could set roles and responsibility for all stakeholders, including governments, regional bodies, private sector, and users. It could address a number of important aspects, including life cycle thinking and policymaking, regional collaboration and approaches for harmonization of practices and products, product processes and standards, target setting, for example, for collection and recycling, licensing and registration of products, processes and users, and mandatory extended producer responsibility. It could provide a basis for governments to adopt legal, policy, and management frameworks to address agricultural plastics holistically within the context of food security, nutrition, food safety, and sustainable agriculture. There are knowledge gaps. The study identified a number of knowledge gaps and areas for further research. The most important ones are the global flows and fates of agricultural plastics, life cycle assessment of fossil-based and bio-based agricultural plastics and their alternatives, pathways for impacts of micro, macro, and nano plastics in agro ecosystems, food safety and human health, and the behavior of and rate of degradation of biodegradable products in different environments and in conditions of temperature and humidity. And this includes aquatic environments and soils in various climatic zones, products not in direct contact with soil, and synergistic effects with other chemicals. And lastly, the impacts of agricultural plastic pollution on microbiomes, soil and water quality, and long-term soil productivity. While there are gaps in the data, this should not be an excuse not to act. We hope this report will serve as a loud call to coordinated and decisive action to facilitate good management practice. I also welcome and congratulate the EIA on their excellent work and the new global treaty, and on the opportunities and challenges around the creation of a new binding global agreement on practice use, which I hope will include and address plastics in agriculture. Thank you.
Richard, thank you so much for that presentation and for managing to distill a huge and complex topic into a 15-minute presentation. Really hats off to you. What I'm going to suggest, I've seen that there's already one question for you in the chat. So what I would say to participants is that Richard will be joining us on a panel in the second half of this session. And so rather than having a Q&A now, we'll be bringing him back. So either store up your question until then, or pop it in the chat, and I'm sure Richard can squirrel away answering some of those questions in the meantime during the session. So I think with that, I'll just thank you again, Richard. That was a really fantastic overview and introduction. And what we'll do now is go from that big picture and that sort of huge knowledge dump to a more localized look at the issue. And so I'm going to hand over now to Ben Phillips, who's from our co-hosts AAE, who will talk in a bit more detail about the work that he and his team have been doing with growers in Spain. So Ben, over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll just hopefully you can all see that full screen.
Yep, we can see it fine. Thanks, Ben.
Great, thank you. I'll give you a quick background to AAE for those of you who are not familiar with us. As Chris said, we're an NGO from mainly working in Spain. Been working in this sector for over 10 years. Originally started as a marine specific NGO looking at plastic pollution in the sea. In 2015, AAE was the first organisation to bring the issue of agroplastic to the Ministry of Environment in Spain. And that resulted in a delegation being sent down to South Spain in Murcia, and ongoing attention from them. As well as our work kind of directly on land with agriplastics, the continued data collection, volunteer cleanups of beaches, and other educational work goes on constantly. So specifically in the agricultural sector, we pretty early worked out that fighting against the farmers or pointing the fingers at them for their use of an end product was not going to be helpful and wasn't going to get us anywhere. So we're working with farmers at the farm level, really working hard to develop networks and get them involved in these trials. The trials have been various companies looking at alternative materials, focusing really on the practical and the economic value of those materials, rather than scientific results of how those materials behave compared to conventional plastics. And this is largely because if the farmers are not on board with the practical ability of those materials to work alongside what they do currently, they're unlikely to take them up. we're also constantly communicating these issues, both of the agroplastic and the marine environment, and at the same time conducting our own kind of guided research into new materials and new methods. So that, on paper, started as a 2018 report for the regional government about waste management generally, went on to work with Novamont, a bioplastics company, facilitating trials of mulch, first at very small scale and then some hectare trials, as well as clips for vine crops. Evaporation mitigation research, which was centered around a circular economy product which was made from recycled agroplastic and then put on agricultural reservoirs to reduce evaporation, and then continued experimentation with new materials that are directly from agriculture, either plastic waste or plant waste. Here's just a little collage of what we've been up to. In the top left, pools to evaluate evaporation mitigation performance. These on the bottom left are the recycled plastic evaporation mitigation devices in a reservoir. And then some of the clips which were found on the beach. These are the clips that hold things like tomato crops to the twine in the greenhouses. In the middle there, some biodegradable mulch, and down to the bottom right, a prototype recycled plastic seed tray and a mycelium seed tray, mycelium grown from a tomato plant feedstock. So our survey in 2021 is the kind of main focus of my presentation. We had done many feedback surveys for specific projects, and realized that there was quite a lot of things we didn't know, and those things that were preventing us from having a bigger picture view. So we decided to conduct this larger scale survey, which looked at the grower's perspective, trying to find out what the current practice was around all sorts of elements of crop production, because even within the same produce in the same area, growers have quite different practices. We're also looking for some of the facts and figures that were unavailable elsewhere to enable us to quantify either the impacts of plastic use or then further enabling calculations for transition to other materials. So a good example here is transitioning from conventional mulch use to a biodegradable compostable use. Even large operations may not have in their accounting an accurate figure for how much time it takes them to remove existing mulch from their fields, and therefore cannot give a good evaluation of replacing that with a mulch that they can till in to the field, and understand that the balance economically of moving to that material. And then finally, the bigger picture of the market influences. Obviously, because much of our work is in direct contact with the growers, there's lots of conversations that go alongside the feedback surveys and general work. So we wanted to really understand their views on what pushed them to make the choices they make, and the general influences on the market. So this was primarily focused at the growers in Murcia, and actually one grower in Almeria. So the majority of these growers are working with open field crops. We also asked very short questionnaires of other stakeholders in the sector to give some context, to give some corroboration and better understanding of some of the questions that we actually needed to ask the growers in the first place. So the growers involved in the survey specifically, it was a long survey, and in that it gives you an idea of their commitment to this. So 91 questions were asked. That would vary depending on the nature of their operations. And to give some perspective about the value of this, the answers from these people, that combined annual turnover is estimated to between 400 and 500 million euros. These 12 growers represent nearly 12,000 hectares of land, combined experience of over 190 years, employing a lot of people. 10 of these are Global Gap certified, or 99.9% by area of owned land. Several of the figures that I've given, I'll say how many out of the 12 were represented, and then also give the area of owned land. Some of the very small growers and some of the very large growers obviously weigh in, but to give you a perspective by area of land, both are quoted. So they're producing, as I said, mostly open field crops, but also quite a lot of greenhouse crops like tomatoes, and some fruit products, but mainly it will be the watermelon, the melons, lettuces, broccoli, that will make up the large proportion of this. So the questions that we asked covered a whole range of things, but we focused particularly on plastic use and the bigger picture of how that relates to water use. So there will be a small part on that as well. The greenhouse production, as we've heard from Richard, in southern Spain, you've probably seen pictures of Almeria, which is totally covered in plastic, and you can see that from space. That is these multi-layer LDPE EVA films lasting 2 to 4 years. I should say that everything that follows are answers from the growers. They're not research or my own opinion. These are all the answers we've got from the growers. The end of life for these plastics is collection by a regulated company. Ferroliva is a big collection company in southern Spain, and we spoke to them separately with one of our shorter questionnaires to match up their replies with the growers' replies. They estimate they're recycling 100%. You can make your own judgment about that, but because of the value of this recyclate and the fact that it comes off fairly clean and it's fairly easy to remove and collect, it does have a value, and therefore it's worth picking it up. Netting also used, much less so now than it was in the past. This is harder for the farmers to get rid of, and it's often what you see in the environment, but less information generally about that. The open field production, which is, again, as Richard touched on with the mulch film, again, everyone is using this mulch film. This is basically essential to growing produce in that area of the world. And it comes with quite a lot of drawbacks. As you can see here, Ferroliva estimates only 40% is recycled, the rest going to landfill, largely because it's full of dirt, and even that which does go to recycling is costly, quite likely more costly than it's worth, because it's covered in dirt, has to be repeatedly washed and then dried before it can be recycled. It also contaminates other recycling streams. So 5 of the 7 growers were using oxidogradable or another petrochemical-based biodegradable plastic mulch, and only one uses a conventional polyurethane mulch, polyethylene, sorry, and one uses a biodegradable compostable starch-based mulch on over 300 hectares of land. This in itself is an interesting and concerning, because the oxidogradable is obviously designed to degrade and therefore starts to degrade often in the field, but they have to remove it because it otherwise leaves plastic fragments. And many people would say that it's actually better to use conventional plastic mulch that can effectively be removed than to use a oxidogradable with an additive that may be more likely to leave fragments behind. So looking more broadly at their kind of use of biodegradable and biodegradable compostable materials, all the 7 growers with open field farms have tried these materials, and probably 5 of those 7 would have been with our trials with Novamont. As I said before, one of them has been using compostable material on a large scale for a year, for I think actually more like 3 years now, and that was independent of us. There is generally a lack of knowledge about these products, and that is really focused around the difference between biodegradable material that was used in the past, which is essentially a petrochemical based product with additives to make it degrade in the environment, and more modern biodegradable compostable materials that can be tilled back into the soil. That's given them skepticism about the poor performance of these other materials, not simply from an environmental perspective, but also because they frequently started to degrade before the end of the crop cycle. The price, inevitably, as with most new materials, it's more expensive than what they're using at the moment, and that prevents a kind of smooth transition. So we also asked them about their more general awareness and understanding of recycling. Only one grower could estimate what percentage of plastic is currently recycled, and they weren't correct. So the others were not sure. So 8 out of 12 said they would be prepared to pay more for products used in production that were made of recycled material rather than virgin material. Down to the left here, we have the recycled plastic EMDs, which are used to prevent evaporation on the reservoirs. And 11 out of 12, or basically all by land, think there should be a mandated recycled product content for products used in agriculture. Some of the questions also went on to talk about the environment, to get their general opinion. 10 out of the 12 were worried about the long-term effects of plastic pollution. 11 out of the 12 worried about soil degradation because of accumulation of plastic fragments in the soil. General feeling was that awareness, and this is of other farmers in general, and insufficient infrastructure are barriers to improving plastic pollution. I should say that over those 91 questions, some of them are very easy to quantify results, yes and no's figures, and then some of them are much more wordy and harder to pull out a consistent thread from as a grower's opinion. And then only 4 of the 12 growers believe the local authorities handle the waste effectively, and only 2 think that they're strict enough with the issue of plastic pollution from agriculture. As I said, this water use it's impossible to disconnect water use from the use of plastic. As you heard from Richard, that's one of the key reasons for using plastic, particularly mulch, is the retention of water. And in this area of the world, it's extremely important. So again, these figures are just from these 12 growers. So 60 million cubic meters of water are used every year. Interesting that their range is between 2,300 and 8,500 cubic meters per hectare. So a very large difference in the water use in the same region, farming very similar crops. In terms of cost, that's 29 million euros a year. And when asked about evaporation, a very large difference in the estimated evaporation from their reservoirs, and only half of them had an estimation. other questions that we asked were around the use of meters for into and out of reservoirs. And a lot of them don't have those meters, so they wouldn't be able to calculate how much they were losing either by evaporation or losses through leakage, etc. So 10 of the 12 are worried about water scarcity in the region. Surprised it's not all of them, as that area has been in a state of scarcity since at least 2017. We also looked at the influences on resource use during production. By and large, the growers that we've come into contact with have been progressive and very determined to do the right thing, and obviously aware in their own interests that conserving resources, protecting the environment is a long-term way of ensuring their business success, if nothing else. But we, after, as I said earlier on, many discussions with growers at various times, realized that there are other influences in the market. So we asked about the actual produce. 8 out of the 12, or 99.6% by area, said that the size, shape, and color of their produce, if that wasn't so important to the buyers, the water, chemical, and plastic inputs could be reduced in production. One organic producer estimated the reduction in water use could be as much as 40% if those factors, size, shape, and color, weren't so important to the buyers. 7 out of the 12 growers, or 70% by area, said that their produce would taste better if it didn't have to be a certain size, color, and shape. We also looked at the growers' view of how other people's perception of the market, so the buyers and the customers. All of the growers thought produce is too cheap generally. You might think that's an obvious thing. 11 out of 12 put this down to the expectation of buyer and consumer rather than simply supply-demand forces. So it's not just simply competition from other areas or between each other. 8 of the 12, or 99.9% by area, said that other factors of production and distribution strongly influenced by the buyer resulted in a negative environmental impact. This is a quote from one of the growers. Low price and high yields demand force us to create more intensive production, and this affects the environment. So with cost in mind, we asked them what they would do differently in their growing practice if they had a higher price for their produce. This is obviously just an example, hypothetical, and the answers are from all of the growers. Many of them had similar answers, and this gives you an idea. So better working conditions for their workers, reduced plastics, pesticides, and fertilizer use, more investment in R&D, more experimentation, less intensive growing to improve soil quality, greater investment in sustainability, and more focus on production at the correct time of year. The seasonal aspect came up a lot in various questions. The demands by the buyer and the consumer to have products all year round is a very common bugbear for the grower.
Sorry to interrupt, Ben. I was just wondering if I could give you a sort of like 1-minute warning, if that's all right. I'm sorry to rush you because this is all absolutely gold.
No worries. I'm getting there, very nearly there.
Thanks.
Okay, so we also asked about the awareness of the market. So that bigger supply chain, what are they aware of about the growers' practices? 8 of that 12 said the buyers do ask about the environmental impact of production. 7 of the 12 think their buyers have a good knowledge of those production methods. Again, a quote from a grower: yes, absolutely, we have annual visits and they monitor our production. Moving from there, 8 out of the 12 think that pressure to bring costs down results in some farmers behaving irresponsibly with their waste materials. 11 out of the 12 by area of owned land think that the buyers have too much power over the market. And some quotes. Of course, they set the standards and the prices. They have it all. They have direct sales to the customer. And they're rather clear they have all the power. So that is the answer to the question, do you think the buyer supermarkets have too much power over the market? And it's worth considering again the growers involved in this are responsible for several thousand hectares each, 12,000 in total, 400 to 500 million turnover a year combined. And this is kind of the end of this presentation. So really asking to consider the potential responsibility for other elements of the supply chain to get involved in and think about, take more consideration of the production methods that the market is influencing the producer to undertake. Thank you.
Ben, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. And I know that there's already a few questions popping up in the Q&A for you about your work with growers and how you've approached that, particularly around building trust with growers, but also some of those questions and findings about the power dynamics, I'm sure will prompt some interesting discussion in the Q&A. So what I'll do right now is just thank you so much for that presentation and also encourage the audience to keep pinging your questions in the Q&A and in the chat box, and Ben will be behind the scenes answering those, and I know Richard's also answered some of the questions that have been posed. And then now I will hand over to Lauren Weir, who's an ocean campaigner at EIA, working very closely with me and the rest of the team. And she's a specialist in UK and EU policy, and particularly leads on our work with retailers. So Lauren, over to you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Jacob, for putting up those slides. So next slide, please, Jacob. I will be providing a very top-line overview of the current state of play of agriplastics in the UK. I know time is of the essence and there's quite a lot to cover, so I'm going to provide a very quick summary and we'll be providing more detail in post-webinar notes. So next slide, please, Jacob. I think Richard and Ben covered this section really well. So next slide, please. Thank you. So the role, scope, and impact of the UK's grocery retail supply chain is very much global. The origin of domestic food consumption within the UK has remained relatively steady over the last decade and more, with approximately half of food consumed being produced domestically and the rest imported, mainly from the European Union. In 2020, utilised agricultural land use stood at 71% of the total area of land within the UK. Next slide, please. Although the value of food, feed and drink exports and imports decreased a little in 2020, trade is still significant and steady. The main countries of dispatch for imports into the UK were the Netherlands, Germany, the Irish Republic, France, and Spain, with fresh fruit and vegetables together remaining the highest value category for imports, totaling £6.4 billion in 2020. With regards to agroplastic use, it's also very important to not just look at the largest sourcing regions to understand the impact of the UK retailer supply chain. For example, the UK has traditionally been one of Kenya's leading export destination markets for tea, vegetables, and cut flowers, which in 2020 accounted for 78% of their total exports. Next slide, please. Thank you. So different sources have different estimates when it comes to agroplastic use within the United Kingdom specifically. The Chartered Institution of Waste Management has estimated that around 135,000 tonnes of agricultural plastic waste are produced each year, the majority being non-packaging plastics, including contamination. and that there is currently a significant gap between the amount of agroplastic placed on the market and the amount that's being collected for recycling, which is principally due to high recycling costs and low recycling capacity within the UK. Next slide, please, Jacob. Thanks. So as Richard mentioned, at the global level, there is no current international mechanism that the UK can look to. Within the UK, agricultural waste is now accounted for in all devolved nation waste management regulations as of 2005 and 6. In 2019, Scotland and previously England and Wales have put a ban in place on burning of agricultural plastic, which means farms are now required to dispose of this waste through recycling and reprocessing routes. However, the Environment Agency has noted an increase in the level of illegal agricultural plastic waste exports since then. When it comes to effectively reducing and managing plastic pollution in the UK, this is an incredibly important time. To demonstrate that, I've provided a snapshot of policy developments occurring in England over the last year alone, some applying to all of the UK. Despite this increased attention, agricultural plastic use is not yet sufficiently reflected in any of these relevant policy frameworks. Next slide, please. Thanks. But that doesn't mean action isn't taking place. For instance, the UK has voluntary producer responsibility collection and recycling schemes, including the launch of Agriculture, Plastic and Environment UK in March 2020 and the Green Tractor Scheme. Next slide, please. And as Mary mentioned within her welcome speech, we have been able to monitor UK retailer action on agroplastics within our annual Checking Out on Plastics survey. So in 2017, the first year of our survey, all retailers, apart from one, were not really taking concrete or specific action as of yet throughout their supply chains. They stated that they were exploring recycling options, working to establish guidance, looking for opportunities to reduce usage where appropriate, or stated that they requested to see reduction strategies from suppliers, but didn't necessarily have a framework or requirements with regards to that. One instance of a retailer saying that both tunnels and apple growing ground covers were fully recovered. However, there was no specification as to whether this was a retailer requirement or how much of the supply chain this included. And there was one retailer expecting global GAP standard requirements from their fruit and vegetable producers. In 2018, there was definitely improvement. All but one retailer stated they were currently working on the issue. 4 retailers cited awareness raising or encouraging reduction campaigns throughout their supply chain. Some retailers cited measures being undertaken by some of their own suppliers, but not necessarily as a result of these being retailer requirements. 4 retailers expected suppliers to adhere to global GAP standards, 1 expecting suppliers to adhere to the Red Tractor standard, and 1 retailer committed to funding a PhD studentship to understand whether single-use plastics can be reduced in food production. And in 2019, there was a lot more detail provided, more external standards required of suppliers and new trials in place. One trial, for instance, was assessing plastic reduction initiatives within livestock rearing processes, 1 trial on biodegradable mulch films and biolubricants, and 1 trial to reduce agricultural plastic within the Christmas tree supply base. We had 2 retailers citing work with fruit and vegetable suppliers to reduce unnecessary plastics, and 1 retailer starting an NGO partnership to identify key sourcing regions that have a plan to address agroplastic pollution. So in 2019, we had 3 retailers requiring suppliers to follow global GAP standards, 3 requiring Red Tractor standards, 1 commitment to sourcing 100% of own brand milk from a supplier that had its own voluntary EPR scheme, and 1 retailer committed to increasing the number of LEAF certified farms, that's linking environment and farming certified farms. So over the course of these 3 surveys, we've seen an improvement in awareness and action, but collective, measurable and time-bound retailer-specific targets are to follow. As a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic, we decided to pause the Checking Out on Plastic survey So the 2019 response is the latest we have collated on these measures. Next slide, please. And so since 2017, we've been aware of the lack of attention there has been on agroplastic pollution. And we authored a briefing in 2018 outlining 6 recommendations for retailers to help them, mainly focused on reduction, redesign, the immediate halting of microplastics in agricultural applications, and recommending retailers collaboratively engage not only with each other, but standard setters, as well as the policy process. Next slide, please. So our next steps is to develop this program of work even further. Some areas of work we're looking into include providing additional research and guidance, monitoring developments taking place in other major sourcing regions like the European Union, with regards to the policy framework they are currently looking into with regards to bio-based, biodegradable and compostable plastics, identifying opportunities within UK policy and legislation to help support solutions, including the DEFRA Sustainable Farming Initiative, and closing loopholes that's currently enabling illegal waste trafficking. To obviously continue our engagement with retailers who are very key stakeholders able to support change and provide a level playing field, and provide a collaborative and build a collaborative network of stakeholders across the entire supply chain with a primary focus on farmers and growers to find operational solutions. And we are really looking to act as a catalyst, enabling and supporting change. And so we're very interested to get feedback from you all to understand where exactly we can add value. And that's it for me. Next slide. Thank you very much.
Lauren, thank you so much for that overview of the retailer work. Some really interesting findings there. So I think we've been quite fortunate to hear quite a range of different perspectives so far. We've had the sort of big picture, what we know at the global level, some of the data and knowledge gaps, priority agroplastics. We've also heard the perspective of the growers, and we also have a kind of sense of what the retail sector knows or is doing about this topic so far in the UK. And I'm hoping the next presentation will sort of bring this into focus a little bit now by providing an example of a framework that already exists. As Richard pointed out, there's a kind of range of options that are highlighted in the FAO report, from the need for an internationally legally binding instrument on plastic pollution that includes agroplastic, but also soft law and codes of conduct as other approaches. It's something that's certainly holistic. And so the work that the Global Ghost Gear Initiative have been doing on fishing gear, which is one of the identified agroplastics in the FAO report, might provide some useful learnings for when considering agroplastics on land as well, and in particular how the Global Ghost Gear Initiative is working with different actors throughout the supply chain. So I'd like to introduce Joel Baziak, who's the Associate Director of the Global Ghost Gear Initiative, who's joining us at 5 in the morning from Canada. So thank you, Joel, and I'll just hand directly over to you.
Great, thanks, Chris. Appreciate that. And let me just share my screen here. And it's, to be fair, it's 6 a.m. now, so a little bit more reasonable, but very happy to be here. Hoping that everyone can see that now. So thank you for that quick introduction. I apologize. I will try to get through this very, very quickly to allow more time for the panel discussion. So apologies for the pace here, but the presentation can be made available if need be. And of course, always happy to answer follow-up questions. So as Chris said, a quick introduction. My name is Joel Baziak. I'm the Associate Director for the Global Ghost Gear Initiative. And my experience is mainly from the commercial fishing industry here in Canada, where I live just south of Vancouver. I created an end-of-life net recycling program there, and then started getting involved with the Global Ghost Gear Initiative back at the beginning when it was launched in 2015. So been involved with it since the very beginning. And as Chris mentioned, and as Chris and I used to be colleagues working on it under World Animal Protection, it's really about bringing everyone around the same table and talking about this issue, which is one of the themes that we've been talking about today, talking to the growers, talking to the producers, those who are actually working within the industry to talk about some lasting changes. So first of all, what is ghost gear? It's a common name for abandoned, lost, discarded fishing gear. It's been mentioned here. It is, apologies. It's the most harmful form of plastic pound for pound when it comes to marine debris and interactions with marine life. There are disparate estimates of how much actually ends up in the ocean every year. One study from 2009 suggested about 10% of marine debris ends up being lost in the ocean every year just due to regular fishing practices and some disposal as well. More recent studies suggest 46 to 70% of the floating macroplastic in the ocean gyres, maybe lost gear. And it can affect up to 5 to 30% of global harvestable fish stocks, which affects communities, affects fisher livelihoods, affects everybody. What causes it? I mean, there are many causes of lost fishing gear. Similar to agriplastics, it's ubiquitous. Wherever there's fishing, there's going to be some amount of gear loss just through normal fishing operations. So things like strong currents that break it loose from its moorings, or snags beneath the surface on rocks or reefs or wrecks or things that the fishers can't see, conflict with other gear. There's a lot of different legitimate reasons why gear gets lost during normal fishing operations. It's not something that any fisher ever wants to have happen, but it is something that does actually happen. And when it comes to indirect causes, lack of disposal facilities, as has been mentioned previously, inaccessible disposal facilities and expensive disposal options, depending on where you are in the world, can lead to discard tossing gear over the boat as a means of disposal. But this is comparatively rare, but in areas where there are no other options, we're talking about small island developing states, areas where there are no recycling infrastructure whatsoever, or even landfill options, some of that does take place. So what is the Triple GI? As I mentioned, it was created by World Animal Protection in 2015. It has been housed under Ocean Conservancy since 2019 as the host organization, taking it on from World Animal Protection. It is the only cross-sectoral alliance in the world dedicated to solving the problems of lost and abandoned fishing gear worldwide. And again, as Chris mentioned, we want to take a holistic approach. We want to improve the health of aquatic ecosystems, protect aquatic life from harm, safeguard human health and livelihoods, all of those things. Pardon me, I don't know what's happening with the presentation here, my apologies. Safeguard human health and livelihoods. All of those things are equally important, so we approach it from a very specific direction, and that we want to actually take all three of those approaches at once. It's not about one being more important than the other. And we want to prevent gear from being lost by promoting best practices. We want to mitigate the impacts if it does get lost, either through technology or changes in practice where appropriate. And we want to remediate the effects of lost gear via targeted removal efforts where it makes sense to do so. So we do take a holistic approach to the issue. We believe everyone has a part to play. When it comes to that, we have a global reach, 125 member organizations from around the world, 18 supporting governments, 4 high-level global affiliates. It's really, again, about bringing all these different stakeholders around the same table to talk in what we call a safe space. Everyone has different perspectives, and that's okay, but everyone's working towards the same goal ultimately. And it's been mentioned several times here today, but engagement in the industry is crucial. We want to raise awareness about the issue within the industry, about the causes of gear loss. We also want to learn from the industry about what causes gear loss. What are the main challenges that they face, and ensure that that is a two-way street, that's a two-way dialogue, so that we can have some lasting change as a result of that. We want to develop innovative solutions to minimize gear loss and reduce its impact when it is lost. Work with the industry for appropriate disposal options for end-of-life gear, and crucially ensure that solutions are viable, lasting, and make sense for the industry. Our theory of change includes having industry at the table, getting industry to see how ALDFG or ghost gear is harmful to their own operations and their bottom line, in addition to the environmental impacts more broadly. It makes it far more likely that they will engage positively on the issue at hand, helps ensure lasting impacts and dedication to the topic over the longer term. 2 tools we've developed for that are our best practice frameworks for the management of fishing gear, which is focused on wild capture fisheries, and our recently released best practice framework for the management of aquaculture gear. They're comprehensive guidance documents that are meant to reference all actors in the seafood supply chain, so from harvesters themselves all the way through to retailers, fishing companies, academia, gear technology companies, policymakers. Everyone in the seafood supply chain has a part to play. So the guidance is across prevention, mitigation, and recovery strategies, pardon me, I don't understand what's happening with this presentation. My apologies for that. But the documents are designed to be incorporated into CSR policies, CSR documents, seafood management plans, voluntary guidelines. It's really meant to be a sort of a global overview of the situation, and then a place to start when it comes to applying some of the things within there to operations around the world throughout all of those different seafood supply chain actors. There are about 12 different organizations, or sorry, I should say stakeholder groups that are assessed through each one of those, each with their own specific set of recommendations within. And then there's also risk assessments for the gear classes that are used in each one of those, and sort of a relative rudimentary risk assessment so you can know where to focus your efforts based on those, depending on where you are in the stakeholder supply chain. Also, collecting data has been mentioned. The GGI has the largest collection of ghost gear records on Earth in our global data portal, where we encourage NGOs, seafood companies, anybody who has access to those data sets, marine debris collection organizations, to submit data as a sort of one-stop shop for all things ghost gear data related, so that there's one place that everyone can go to get raw data and use that in research purposes. I can go into a little bit more detail about that later if anyone's interested. And just noting some of our solutions projects, we do try to have a global footprint, and they vary just as local conditions vary. So as mentioned by Ben, we have different conditions in Nigeria, in Canada, Indonesia, Mexico, the United States, Vanuatu, the Caribbean. Local conditions vary, but some of the same principles apply. And some of these projects could consist of data gathering, predictive modeling as to where some of that gear is going to end up, fisher surveys, community and fisher engagement, targeted gear removal, recycling where possible, testing new technologies, gear marking trials, local solutions for end-of-life gear disposal, et cetera, et cetera. I know that was a lot to blow through very quickly, but I want to give the panelists an opportunity to answer some of the questions and to have a dialogue, so I will end it there. Contact information is there. Happy to talk to anyone who's interested in having a conversation. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present, and looking forward to the panel.
Joel, that was truly lightning speed, so thank you. That was a really fantastic overview of the great work that the GGI does, and certainly some very interesting parallels and considerations for how it could be applied to agriplastics more broadly. In about 1 minute, I'm going to ask all of the speakers to pop your cameras back on, and we'll have about 20 minutes for a discussion and answer some of the questions from the audience. First of all, though, my colleague Jacob has set up some polls, and he'll take us through those, and they're just to get a kind of temperature check of what everyone listening is thinking if you haven't been asking questions. So Jacob, I'm just going to hand over to you to do the polling.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, of course. So yeah, we also, I've really enjoyed all the talks today, and I think we also wanted to hear from you, as Chris mentioned. So I'll run the first poll, and the first poll question is it's a single choice. So if we had to choose one priority focus for agroplastic, what would it be? And so the poll should be live now. You'd be able to answer it. Okay, we've got some answers filtering in now. We've got about half of the participants answering now. I'll run it for a few more seconds and then we'll start to share the answers. Okay, great. Well, so as the answers are kind of filtering in, we look at most people have picked, about 60% have looked at cultivation, mulch, greenhouse film, netting and twine. Then also the areas of focus are livestock, agro-processing and seeding. So you should be able to see the results there on your screen now, which I think is really enlightening to see the kind of focus we've got on cultivation. I've got the second poll. So it's again a single choice. What kind of solutions or alternatives would you like to know more about? I'll run this again for another 30 seconds to a minute. Once you start getting your answer. lot of options on that list. Great, as they're coming in, we've got a lot of answers for all of the above, which is great. Everyone wants to learn more about everything. There's also biodegradable agriplastics is a popular answer, as well as increased recycling capacity and availability, which we've heard a little bit about today as well. So I'll just end this poll here, and everyone can see the results, which is really interesting. But yeah, overwhelmingly 40% of you would like to know more about everything, which is awesome. And just very quick one, were you aware of the environmental impact of agroplastic pollution before joining this webinar? And they're zooming in today for this question, which is overwhelmingly everyone was aware prior to this. A couple of people who weren't, and a couple of people who weren't but would like to know more about it, which again is great. I'll just close this poll and share the results with everyone. See, everyone seemed to, a lot of people were aware of the issues. This is a multiple choice question, which is available here. So this would be, what other associated issues would you like to know more about? And I'll launch a poll, so you can select more than one answer on this one. Some answers starting to come in now, where a lot of people are interested in microplastic contamination of sludge, illegal plastic waste trade and trafficking. Certainly greenwashing under the guise of biodegradable alternatives is a popular answer, but we've actually got quite a widespread answers here in terms of the answers we're getting. I'll just run the poll for another few more seconds and then I'll share the results with you all. Here are the results. As you can see, a very mixed bag in terms of what associated issues people are interested in. So I think that's really, I think that a lot of these answers showing we've got a very interested audience today in terms of our questions. And finally, who are you? We've got a long list of kind of where the kind of our audience has come from today. This is a single choice. If you do have another answer and you're other and you feel comfortable to pop it on the chat. If you don't, that's also totally fine. So we've got answers coming in. We'll share them shortly. But we see we've got except for an EPR scheme, we've got representatives from all of the options here, which I think is really encouraging to show the kind of breadth of interest in this issue from lots of different stakeholders. So I'll just share that one finally with you all. You can see that we've got a really nice spread of attendees today. And with that, that's my part of the day done. Thank you for participating in the polls. Now I'll hand back over to you, Chris.
Great. Thank you so much, Jacob. That was super interesting. I have a perennial fear of anything super techy, but I think it was really worthwhile to hear a little bit from the audience. So thank you everyone for participating. So at this point, I will kindly ask the speakers to pop your videos back on so we can be sure that you're there. Yeah, we've got about 15 minutes to answer some questions. And it's quite tricky actually to know where to begin. I know there was a lot of questions that were coming in the Q&A, so thank you everyone for answering those. I might kick off with a question from Paula that was in the chat. So she was asking, This issue, it's tied to the bigger problem of ever increasing demand for out of season and high spec products. How do we identify and advocate for the systemic shifts that are required to reduce demand and consumption overall, rather than just focusing on end of life solutions and technology fixes? I mean, that's a big question, but I would be really interested if someone would like to have a bash at answering that. Maybe Richard, could I put you on the spot?
You can do. Yeah, I think it's a strange thing that has happened to this world. You know, where I live in Italy, product is generally seasonal. You know, I can't buy oranges outside the period when they're available from Italy. And I think, you know, we need to try to educate the public again on what seasonal produce are, and you know, take advantage of the good products when they are in season and move on to something else. You know, a strawberry tastes fantastic in May, in December, not so good.
Ben?
I would add, ask the growers, have a session where you ask the growers what they think and how they can change that.
I think that's a really good point, Ben, and I think you really spoke to this in your presentation. And I wonder if perhaps you or Joel have any advice on that kind of listening that's required when you're building these types of initiatives. You know, you have a lot of publications, reports, and sort of like top-down pressures, but at the end of the day, there are people on the ground or on the water who are the ones who need to do these things, and they also need to be resourced and equipped to do them. So, I mean, so ask the growers, ask the fishers, okay, but how? Okay, have you got any advice?
Well, I mean, you could argue who's responsible for that demand, whether it's the supermarkets or the consumer. That's probably a separate issue. But let's just assume it's the supermarkets. Then they have direct contact with the growers already. They are buying from them directly. It would be very easy for them to ask their opinion in a forum that is already existing. And collectively, if supermarkets decided, for example, to get together and say, we're not going to focus so much on having whatever you like whenever you like it, can we make some decisions together? The main members of the market could change that.
Yeah, and you know, from a fishing perspective, I think that it's a kind of an interesting situation we have here is that there is a very large hake fishery where I'm from, just outside of Vancouver, and there's no local consumption of it at all. It is 100% exported. And I think that if there's a drive to you know, have some of that consumed more locally, then you might be able to do something similar, not only with other fish species, but with other agricultural products as well that might not be consumed locally where they're produced. When they're, as Richard said, at their peak of, you know, producing those strawberries that are in May, if those are getting shipped somewhere else, maybe there's a you know, a more considered effort that can be made to educate people about that, and that it is going to taste better, and you're probably better off eating strawberries in May.
Yeah, it's really, really good points. I think sort of slightly unrelated but related, there's quite a few questions that have been asked, and it sort of speaks a bit to the root of, I think, Paula's question around the non-conventional plastics. So, and I think that's perhaps where she was getting at with the technology fixes. You know, we're constantly seeking solutions that aren't really addressing the problem, if you see what I mean, and biodegradable or oxo-degradable plastics could be one example of that potentially. I would be really interested to hear some of your reflections on the risks associated with those, and also what the kind of policy context is for that at the moment. Both what policy do we have, what standards do we have, and what are we looking for? Perhaps Lauren, I don't know if you wanted to have a go at that.
Yeah, I can definitely have a go. I'd like to apologize in advance. There's some work being done in my building, and they kindly paused drilling for this webinar, but they've started again. So if it gets too loud, just let me know.
Will do.
I think it's something that we really do need to look into. Biodegradable alternatives, especially with regards to mulch, is something that really could be a great solution to a lot of the issues we're seeing, especially for farms in remote regions where accessibility to recycling facilities is just very difficult to come by. There are biodegradable standards in place, but we do have to keep in mind certain limitations with regards to them. For instance, there is a biodegradable mulch standard in Europe, EN 170-33, that really needs to be reviewed, whereby it doesn't necessarily account for all the climatic and field conditions within which said mulch can biodegrade. And it doesn't necessarily simulate the environmental conditions that said mulch could find itself in, mainly marine environments, for instance, and this needs to be monitored and taken into account a lot more. Specifically with regards to the UK, I think one thing to be wary of is the risks of using oxo-degradable plastics in agricultural applications, like film and silage, where there is very little evidence that these plastic fragments will actually undergo full biodegradation. Apologies if you hear the drilling. Within a reasonable time frame, that is, and it's something that the European Union has decided to take action on within their single-use plastics directive, but it wasn't actually transposed into UK law post-Brexit. So I think that's something that UK-based farmers and growers should really be aware of. And as is the case with any product that we see, greenwashing is present within biodegradable agroplastics as well. What's being sold, how it's being managed, within which climatic regions it can be best applied. And so sharing of best practice and guidance between retailers, growers and farmers, I think would be very beneficial. If that helps answer it.
Definitely. And Richard, I could see you nodding when Lauren was talking. I don't know if you've got anything to add from your experience of that kind of global piece of research and where we see this heading when it comes to the non-conventional alternatives.
Okay, yeah, it's a complex issue. There are two European projects underway to assess biodegradable plastics used in mulching, Minagris and Papillon. You can look them up on the EU site. You know, they were looking to understand the long-term effects of using these materials. So that's one issue. The other issue is that the degradability of these materials varies significantly. If you're using them in Finland or use where there's moisture and it's colder, or you're using them in Spain where it's drier and hotter, you know, they degrade at different rates, and depending on the what you're using them for, how many seasons you're trying to get into a year, will affect the product that you're using. So there needs to be much more work done on understanding the degradability of these materials.
Joel, please go ahead. Thank you, Richard.
Just very quickly to jump on that is that I think we need to be careful overall when we're talking about biodegradable plastics and what does biodegradable mean, because you know, as Lauren had mentioned, if it just breaks down, and Richard, you mentioned this earlier too, if it just breaks down into microplastics more quickly, you're doing more harm than good in a lot of cases, particularly as more and more research is poured into the effects of microplastics on human health, because it is going up through the food chain, whether it's through, you know, the seafood, you know, going up right through those trophic levels up to human consumption, or whether it's done in agriculture. Biodegradable plastic, whether it's something that's compostable, is it made of a fossil fuel, or is it made of some sort of a starch that is just, you know, going to be more or less benign? And we need to be very careful about when we're looking at the research behind that to make sure that we're not causing more of a problem by introducing biodegradable plastics.
Yes, really, really good point, Joel. Thank you. And I think one of the other things that's come out quite strongly, both in the polling and also in some of the questions that are being asked, is about the role of recycling, or collection and recycling, and where that fits in. I would be very interested in any kind of reflections, either Ben, from your experience with the growers and what that looks like in practice. You know, what's the capacity and what are some of the barriers to collection and recycling, but also, you know, what might we ask for in terms of, you know, recommendations to retailers and policymakers about our expectations and hopes on the recycling of agricultural plastics.
I think southern Spain is interesting because it on the global scale is very localized and offers a potential to be a real kind of circular economy of that plastic. If you look at how much is used in the area that it's used in, all the recycling companies are present, the collection companies are present. It should be, very, very far down the line, and in some cases it is, but it's very much directed by what's valuable at the end. So as I mentioned earlier, the cleaner, more valued recyclate from the greenhouse sheeting is very widely recycled and successfully recycled. The mulch, which is dirty and difficult to remove, comes out in bits and pieces and then ends up being expensive to recycle once it gets there, if it does get there, it's not so positive. And I suppose something interesting that came up from our surveys of the recycling companies there is that because there's such a large amount of them in that area, material is coming from all over Europe, sometimes 2,000 kilometers to be recycled. And that can only be in existence. I don't know for sure, but I would imagine it can only be the situation by subsidy, because it doesn't make any sense in any other way.
Joel, I can see you nodding, and I'm aware you set up, I think, the first net collection and recycling project for fishing gear in Canada. So I don't know if you've got any sort of, I guess, recommendations for people who might be looking at this when it comes to agroplastics more broadly.
Yeah, we probably don't have time for all of that in the next 3 minutes, but just to touch quickly on it, yeah, I think that as Ben mentioned, the cleanliness of the material is such a huge important thing to play, and if it costs a lot of money to get it to a state where it can be recycled, the economics very easily break when you're trying to do that, especially because there aren't a lot, as much of the Western world has learned over the last few years, where a lot of material is being sent to places in Asia to be recycled. Local recycling infrastructure doesn't exist on the scale that it probably should, which means that transportation logistics, getting that material, first of all, clean enough, and then where are you going to send it? If you're having to send it 2,000 kilometers, there's a carbon footprint associated with that and all the rest of it. So I think it needs to be looked at holistically. Recycling is always it's usually a better option, but it also depends on what do we mean by recycling too. And I think there's a tendency to associate recycling with circular economy, which isn't necessarily synonymous, right? I mean, if it's being recycled into a new thing that it used to be, fine. But if it's being downgraded into something else, then that's not a circular loop. And that's, again, it's just something we need to be aware of. It's not saying that recycling is bad. It's in most cases much better than other alternatives. But I think we need to be just aware of the whole picture of what that actually takes. And yes, Ben, I would agree. Certainly with fishing gear as well. Some of those subsidies, whether it's through EPR or government financing or whatever it is, to set up those logistics networks to make that effective and efficient is going to be paramount. Because if there is no vector for that to get to those systems, then it's going to be disposed of in another way.
Thank you, Joel. And yeah, we could definitely talk about that all day. It's really interesting stuff. So I appreciate we've only got 1 minute left, and yeah, it's impossible to really cover everything that we want to cover. And I really appreciate all of the engagement in the chat. And rather than do a kind of summing up from my perspective, perhaps to kind of bring us home, I would really love if each panelist could give us one recommendation that they would love to pass on to the UK grocery retail sector about a priority action to look at in the next 6 to 12 months, if that's not putting you on the spot. So perhaps, Richard, just going in the order that you're in my screen, maybe you'd like to have a crack.
Okay, I think looking at supply chain assurance schemes, making sure that your supply chains are conform to a standard, and you work with that standard body to ensure that it covers agricultural plastics.
Fantastic. Lauren?
To continue progress on what's already been made, and I think working collaboratively to level the playing field is going to be a really big factor, and also addressing government and making sure that the policy frameworks in place are able to support you as well as your suppliers with the changes that need to happen.
Great, thank you. And Ben, and then Joel.
Thanks. I'd say talk to your suppliers and ask them about these issues and take some responsibility for your role in what goes on. on the ground.
Linking kind of directly to those pieces is just, I would suggest doing a significant risk analysis of your supply chains from top to bottom, using some of the tools like FAO's provided, Richard and his team of colleagues who provided that, like the Triple-J best practice frameworks if you're talking about the fishing industry, both in wild capture and aquaculture. Do those risk assessments and see where your gaps are, and then take the necessary next steps from there. It will vary depending on each organization, of course, and each retailer, but I think those are, you can't take concrete steps until you know what the extent of the problem is in your own specific supply chain. I think that's a good first step.
Thank you, Joel. And that's, I think, the perfect note to end this discussion on. So thank you again to all the fabulous speakers. You've all been brilliant and given us lots of food for thought. And for everyone who joined us today and participated in the polling and asked questions, we'll be sending around some follow-up if you registered for this webinar. So look out for that in your inboxes. And we look forward to continuing a discussion with all of the different stakeholders about this topic, both as we have discussions about the prospective global agreement on plastic pollution next month at EIA, but also as we continue our work with the retail sector. So thank you, everyone, and wishing you a nice morning or afternoon wherever you are. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.